So not too long ago, I made a really funny, cool, life-changing, and amazing video after going on a bit of a shoujo binge. I picked up a bunch of new manga and anime that I fell in love with, and I'm actually thinking about making a part 2 to that video. There's definitely a lot of other series that I was reading during the creation of that video that I wanted to put into it, but I didn't have as much experience with stories written for that demo, so I wanted to be intentional. Not too long after that, I kinda just started reading more manga and watching more anime in general that were definitely scratching a different itch than I had been used to for some time. So here I am talking about a bunch of seinen manga not named Berserk, Vagabond, or Vinland Saga. Let's go. First, I want to do a bit of housekeeping, and then I'll set a bit of the parameters for this video. If you're new to this channel, which again I'm assuming you are because this channel is mostly me just screaming into the void, I'm a relatively new video essayist. In one of my not too distant videos, I talked about my experience getting acquainted / reacquainted with Shoujo and Josei series. If you're not familiar with Shoujo and Josei, you can go and watch that video. It was a lot of fun. I talked about a personal favorite in From Me to You and a bunch of other series that I really do love. The other two demographics for anime and manga are shonen directed at young boys and seinen directed at adult men. I'm sure you've heard of those terms before, and now in 2024, those are the most popular series that you can pretty much see everywhere. I never got too far into all of the degenerate antics, so I didn't necessarily engage with any seinen or adult series, so my first time actually engaging with a proper seinen series was Mushishi. That was a series that I started watching in the last couple of years of high school, and that gave me a new appreciation for what I can enjoy in anime and manga. I was also watching Cowboy Bebop and stuff at the time, so my brain was just like, oh, what's this?
We haven't had anything to eat in 2 days! Wouldn't you call that an emergency?
All I'm asking is who ate the food that was in this container?
I want some bell peppers and beef.
We're out of fuel in the
After being introduced to a few shoujo series towards the end of 2023, I found some interesting stories that I knew I really wanted to talk about someday. Now, before talking about them, I gotta warn you niggas, this is the world of seinen. And although I've read a few stories that aren't blatantly X-rated, a lot of these series aren't afraid to go there. They unabashedly cover a lot of triggering concepts. If you see this symbol, just note that there are going to be some triggering topics covered in the series being discussed outside of good old blood and violence. So now, let's talk about some seinen.
What is the self? And what is the other? What does good mean? What does evil mean? See, my entire life was nothing but questions. I'd have given anything to turn them into answers.
Planets or Planets is a manga by Makoto Yukimura, and you might have heard that name before because I think he wrote something else, I don't know, Google it. Debuting in 1999, Yukimura wrote this series after reading about the debris fields orbiting the Earth that are filled with the remains of deserted spacecrafts left after the Great Space Race of the 60s and 70s. The story follows the members of DS-12, a crew of space debris collectors. Their job is to parole Earth's orbit and get rid of anything that could be harmful to ships going into space, as well as other space stations that are in orbit. In essence, they're garbage men. If you couldn't tell, this is a sci-fi series set in space in the all too distant future of 2075. But the focus of this series isn't just on the use and manufacturing of these scientific marvels. The manga pretty much captures the everyday lives of these garbage men as they deal with their own traumas and tribulations in a world that has prioritized space travel.
Don't rush it. Just stay calm and link up carefully.
I'm copy.
On the DS-12 crew we have Yuri, Hachimaki, and Fi, and after a few chapters we're also introduced to Ai. And all of them have had their own motivations that led them to this career. One of the things that immediately drew me to this manga was this look at the evolution of essential workers. This job is the ground zero of a lot of space travel needs or aspirations of the parties on Earth. With a very traumatic history of failed missions as well as crashing meteors and meteorites, there are millions of things that can get caught in the Earth's orbit. Any object floating around in space could potentially kill thousands of people and set governments back billions of dollars, but still, this is one of the most undermined aspects of space exploration. Through the first couple of chapters, we learn that staying in space for too long creates a multitude of issues. It can lead to the decay and atrophying of muscles, especially considering most of the time in space is in a state of reduced gravity. It can also take a toll on the psyche with the deprivation of social contact as well as the absence of things like sunlight. A few characters explicitly make mention to the effects that being in reduced gravity can have on you. And it's not just on your muscles, it's also on your height and your bone density. We get to meet characters who've spent the majority of their lives in space, and we see that they've hit growth spurts that wouldn't normally be possible on Earth. But the flip side is going back to Earth can leave you with a series of health complications. On the other hand, there are eco-terrorists and social activists that believe that space exploration is not only leading to the degradation of Earth's ozone layer, but it's also feeding an advanced stripping of the Earth's resources. And it's a misdirection of funds into space rather than in the aid of the people on Earth. But all of this stuff is the backdrop to the actual astronauts that we follow throughout the series. I'm gonna try and not give too much away when speaking about the character backstories, but that might be tough. Hachi is the closest thing I can describe as the main character of the series. He is a brash, immature young man who ended up as a space cleaner by sheer force of will. We learn that he's actually an aspiring engineer hoping to get on the next space exploration mission to Jupiter. Hachi's father is a famous pilot that aided in the last Great Expansion mission to Mars, and the frustration he feels around that, along with his own admiration of other famous engineers, is what drives him. Yuki is a tall blonde Russian man who became an astronaut after being in a spacecraft accident years prior. He was on a space shuttle that was using a high-speed orbital path to go from Russia to England, when a window on the spacecraft was struck by a piece of debris that shattered the window. That piece of debris was only about the size of a boat, but it still led to a highly reported incident. Yuki, having gone to the bathroom at the time, is one of the few survivors, and the story shows how he's gone on to live with that guilt. He's kind of like the voice of reason on the crew, and he almost always keeps a calm head, unlike his other crew members. Fee is the leader of the crew and possibly the least developed of the characters. She's a bit rough around the edges, but she offers Hachimaki more grace than he might have deserved at the beginning of the series. She seems content with living her life collecting waste and kind of serves as an external motivator to Hachi as he decides that he wants more from life. Ai is the latest recruit to join the crew, and she kind of comes in as Hachi's replacement for when he goes on his Jupiter mission. She's young, she's brash, but unlike Hachimaki, she's virtuous. She firmly stands on right and wrong as the new recruit, and she actually offers a bit of good energy to a pretty dreary work environment. Trying to describe this series, the only words that come to mind are words like weightless, ambient, atmospheric. A lot of the charm of the series is captured through its breathtaking art. There's so many scenes that really paints this picture of being alone in space. It depicts the solitude as well as the gravity of looking at something you can't really grasp. Reading this was a bit funny having the context of Vinland Saga. The most significant story element comes pretty early on in the series, and it spans about 10 or so chapters, and it deals with Hachi coming to terms with his expectations on his life as an astronaut. When we meet Hachi, he's honestly just a pretty lazy regular guy. He seems to have dreams of doing something else, but he's working this job that takes a lot of energy, and it doesn't seem like he's committed to it at first. He wasn't even doing the proper strength training that you would need to do to be able to withstand traveling between Earth and space consistently. It isn't until after a few smaller parts of the story are expanded upon that he decides that he isn't going to give up on himself, and being a trash collector isn't going to be all he amounts to. And that's when he sets out to join the Jupiter mission. The Jupiter mission is really just a litmus test for himself to get to his bigger dream of buying his own spaceship and traveling space on his own command. The story does a really good job characterizing Hachi and showing us where he comes from, his family dynamic, and expounding on some of the other people that are also in space. But what really kind of took the story up to the next level for me is this very brief section in one of the first couple of chapters. It shows Hachi being either untethered or having his slack kinda let out in the middle of space debris collection at the same time as a solar flare. At that moment he was free falling in space, and it seems that radiation from a solar flare means almost instant death. What happens for Hachi is fortunate, but it leaves a lasting impact. At the same moment of the solar flare, Hachi is caught behind the moon's shadow, so effectively he was protected from the sun's radiation. He was protected from the solar flare, but he was in complete and utter darkness for several minutes without any ability to communicate with his crewmates. That moment right there is depicted in about 2 pages at the beginning of one of the chapters, and it sets on a series of depressive episodes and anxiety attacks that occurs for 10 plus chapters after that. He goes from determined to nihilistic in his struggle to find purpose in living a life that could be ended with the snap of a tether. I think that using that aspect of space to express his sense of apathy was really interesting. I never thought about it, but I very quickly realized how crazy it would be to be drifting in space until you ran out of oxygen. Reading this also brought me back to the topic that it seems Yukimura is really passionate about. This story really delves into the mental health of young adult men and their coping mechanisms. I could definitely see a lot of the inspiration for Vinland Saga, or at least Thorfinn, with reading this group of chapters. I think this is a good point to mention that this series does have an anime adaptation, and it's, they made some choices. And fam, it's not even the same thing, bro. The Planète anime came out with a 26 episode season in 2005. As of this recording, I'm 10 episodes in, and the anime seems to be set up with a bit more of a larger comedic cast in the Debris Collection group. The first couple of episodes are filled with office hijinks and further developed slice of life antics. I think the show so far does a better job at focusing on the lives of the whole crew, but it's funny because honestly, I don't know how you can tell a manga accurate Planète story in a linear season of anime, so I understand the urge to change it, especially during that time. The manga just sort of skips through weeks, months, and years at a time. It's really just more of a collection of short stories and personal character arcs. It's hard to not feel this visceral discomfort at how much of the story is mishmashed to create such a different thing. I had to actively fight that thought when I was watching, but what made it easier was the beautiful animation of this series. I love how the characters move and emote and how soft their features are. I love how clean their designs are too, like it's simple but effective. The colors they use on the characters specifically, but pretty much the whole show, fits the character design so well. The colors they use are generally these pale, almost pastel tones, but they still find ways to create contrast. Sometimes it's just by using shadows and dark outlines to keep things from looking washed out and to keep them sharp, but a lot of it is just through smart uses of contrasting colors. After watching more of the anime, I do want to speak a little more about its merits. I think the story of the anime just tries to streamline the manga story into a narrative that's more consistent, whereas the manga is just a bit more of those vignettes of character arcs. So pros for the anime, you get a connected story and you get to see a lot more of the characters interact with each other. But as for cons, you kind of lose a lot of the esoteric and vibey nature of the manga because the anime condenses those storylines so that they're a bit more together. I'm told that the second half of the anime picks up considerably more than what the first half of the episodes are, so I don't know. If it was up to me, I'd definitely say read the manga first and then take a crack at the anime.
Well, if it isn't the handyman, where are you boys off to in such a rush?
Business, Granny.
Ah, criminy. Those two are always getting their asses into something.
GANGSTA is a manga written by Shinichi Inotsumi that came out in 2011. It also got a 12-episode anime adaptation that aired in 2015 and was produced by Studio Manglobe. You may remember them as the studio that produced Samurai Champloo and another fun series from the 2010s in Dead Man Wonderland. Unfortunately, this manga is currently on hiatus as the author is dealing with some health concerns, and the manga was pretty short-lived as well, as it didn't really get too far into the plot of the series before Manglobe went bankrupt. Now, as for the plot, it begins with some fun, unabashed, everyday gang activity. Like, I can actually draw a straight line between this and something like Sopranos, but like anime.
The f are you looking at? I'll gouge out your eyeballs, I'll in your skull.
Let's see if I can give you the premise. So the story is set in the city of Ergasculum, a town that's more like a 1900s ghetto in the middle of Europe. From the jump, we can see it's overrun by crime, drugs, and guns. In this town, there are special types of humans that are referred to as Twilights. These Twilights are basically people with superhuman speed, strength, and enhanced senses. Originally, it seems the Twilights were created to be used in war through some kind of super soldier type experiment. As it's played out though, all the Twilights now are hooked on a specific drug being pushed through the city called Celebre. The town itself is run by 4 mafia families who each specifically deal in one area of organized crime, and each family hires Twilights as their muscle to be able to distribute or participate in whatever crime they set out to do. They also marked out different areas of the town as their own territory, as most gangs do. Then we have our main crew, the Beniria, or the Handymen. Nick and Warwick basically function as the intergoers between all of the other organizations in this town. They do jobs for each of the families, they do jobs for the cops, they do jobs for a doctor who's pretty much the only doctor that works in that town, Whoever's willing to pay them, they'll do it, and they don't just take money. All in all, they just try to stay pretty partial. Warwick is our lovable Joker guy with an eye patch, and his best buddy Nick is the Twilight who happens to be deaf. I think one of the things that immediately drew me into watching / reading this series is Nick. He's just kind of this enigma when you first see him. He goes from using sign language between him and Warwick, then being this really unhinged, crazy, aggressive fighter, and then he's back to his lazy, aloof self. In the first chapter, they meet a prostitute by the name of Alex Benedetto while they're on a job, and that job happens to help her get away from her pimp. After that though, she has nowhere to go, so she just ends up moving in with them. Finally, what really got me flipping pages is that police were finding Twilight bodies around the town, and the cops couldn't tell whether or not this is gang violence or if this was a hate crime. And as this gets back to the mob bosses, we end up in this standoff. Everyone's trying to figure out who may be behind these attacks or whether there's a fifth party that has Twilights that are much stronger than everyone else's. And speaking of, I forgot to explain the Twilights have a really cool ranking system. As I said before, Twilights were used as super soldiers in the war, and in the war they were given dog tags that showed their strength. Usually it goes off a letter grade and then a number grade. For example, being a C5 is one of the weaker ends of the C rank, whereas being an A rank or an S rank I believe is the strongest that you can possibly be. So yeah, that was a lot, but that's pretty much the premise of the series. Essentially, this is a story about these adjacent factions who are beginning to smell gun smoke in the air. Early in the game, we're meeting different characters, and when we meet them, they're either actively misleading or they're wary of being misled by others. There are many times where I was reading the story and I couldn't tell necessarily if a person was being shady or not. I think one of the strengths of the series is just how well fleshed out all of these characters are and how well fleshed out the world of Ergasculum is, even though it keeps that small town feel. There are only a few locations between all the different factions, but this limitation honestly helped me keep track of who's who. I knew that if we were in a nightclub, we were with the Cristianos, or if we're in a decked out mansion, we're with the Monroes, stuff like that. Another layer that added to the confusion is all of the immigrants that are being pushed into Ergasculum. Because of the lack of police support and the lack of care of what goes on in the city, we get to see how that also impacts the gangs. Most of the immigrants are Twilights, and their growing population affects all of the ecosystem. The Cristianos push the Celebre drugs Twilights need to survive. The Paul Klee Guild offer ex-military Twilights as mercenaries to the other groups. The Monroes seem to be willing to offer housing for Twilights, but the Corsicas are prejudiced against Twilights completely. Ergasculum is filled with crooked and or unenthused police. So within the first couple of chapters, we can see that this is a city that's about to implode.
I don't know what to do, hey. I don't, man. I feel naked out here, B.
When it comes to mafia media, I think one of the genre's superpowers is the way they can centralize humanity in places often written off as devoid of it. There's an innate duality in seeing a character spinning the block and then seeing them struggling with childhood trauma. I think on top of that, they can really play with the viewer's understanding of the idea of organized crime versus the lives of the people in it. It's what makes The Sopranos so transformative. It didn't treat its characters like pieces on a chessboard.
That's what being a boss is. You steer the ship the best way you know. Sometimes it's smooth, sometimes you hit the rocks. In the meantime, you find your pleasures where you can.
Here we get to see bits and pieces of our characters' lives. Pretty much from her introduction in chapter 1, I knew I loved Alex, and you really got a good feel for her in the first 5 or 10 chapters. And throughout the story, we see bits and pieces of her backstory, or at least the pieces that she remembers. Alex had been through a lot of traumatic stuff before she had been introduced to people like Nick and Warwick. We even meet her through a traumatic sequence of events. But she's still a very kind soul, and I thought it was pretty interesting that the way that she seems to show love is through her service to others. She even starts learning sign language, and I feel like all of those things aren't just a manifestation of the objectification that she had experienced prior. It's more so her just trying to build more connection with these two guys that she knows nothing about. On the flip side, we have Warwick and Nick, our independent, out of the way guns for hire. I'm not going to go too far into it, but I really enjoyed the way that the history of their friendship was playing out. They both are great examples of that duality because although they're a point of reference, the way things unfold has you questioning everything. Their morality, their loyalties, their wants, and it's that part really. There's a certain chapter that involved Warwick that I just paused and said to myself, bro, what do you want? Because the story focuses on a lot of exchanges between different factions, the cast is huge. There are a lot of characters that I liked off the rip, but I think it's unfortunate that we don't get to spend a lot of time with them considering the manga is only about 60 or so chapters. There are at least a few character interactions that I really wish I could see the resolution of. I think I'm gonna call it here and not get too deep. I feel like I'd be doing a disservice to these characters to try and summarize them without spoilers with only a few chapters of real context, but man, when this story picks up its pace, it feels like you're in a wind tunnel. I highly recommend GANGSTA. It's a short read, I read it in a few days. And you can probably watch the anime in another few days, but man, it sucks that we're probably not going to get a conclusion to this. This is a funny one to talk about. I gotta throw all of the trigger warnings and red flags on this one, but trust me, we'll get through this together. As of 2022, this is one of the best-selling manga of all time. The concept of this series was unique enough that once I read a bit about it, I was at least a little interested. It's a series that largely covers the white-collar workspace in Japan, and it attempts to approach many of the less than fortunate social aspects of it through melodrama and, let's say romance. The story comes from the perspective of Kosaku Shima, a mid-level manager working in the advertising department of a company that is generally just a reskin of Panasonic in the 80s. Written by Kenshi Hirokane, the series debuted in 1983 and at this point is currently ongoing. Since its debut, the series has followed Shima through all of his promotions throughout his time in corporate. Each time he's promoted, the title of the series changes along with it. So we start off with Section Chief Shima, and that becomes Division Chief to Assistant Director, Director, so on and so forth. I'm not gonna lie to you, this series is something I'd never thought I'd experience through manga. It's just a series of short stories and arcs that capture a lot of these serendipitous but uncomfortable moments that happen working in a corporate setting. I feel like I can only really describe it as like soap opera meets Dilbert.
Wally, what are you doing? Welcoming in the millennium?
By ordering credit cards.
That's right. I'm applying for every credit card I can get my hands on. Then I'll take huge cash advances and wait for the millennium bug to hose the bank's computers. They'll never be able to bill me.
You would have made a great evil mastermind.
Nah, the hours are too long.
It's just some awkward, painful, and heartbreaking work situations. There are stories about divorce, mental health, money laundering, addiction, and the social rights of corporate workers. And it's all shaped around the ways that corporate culture encourages people, i.e. our self-insert of an MC, to turn to vices like alcohol and sex. At first, the story begins as one-off chapters centered around people close to Shima, but they expand into volume-long and sometimes multiple volume-long arcs. The only way I can actually think of positively talking about the series is by getting into more of the individual stories that we get to see. But before we do that, I want to emphasize how much of a straight male-centered fantasy series this is. Like, yes, this is set in a corporate setting in a realistic world, but this is very unrealistic in certain aspects. The first maybe 8 to 12 chapters are explicit, and pretty much every other chapter is leaning towards Shima sleeping with somebody. I do think a lot of it indirectly speaks to the repression of a lot of working class Japanese people and how the lack of work-life balance leads to these covert affairs, but it definitely reads as a nigga just trying to write his workplace fantasies into his own story. One of the first chapters of the story follows a girl that recently started working in Shima's office. She's young and fresh out of college, but the rest of the women in the office don't seem to be taking a liking to her. They don't like her because she comes to the office as soon as it's time to clock in, and she leaves the office as soon as it's time to clock out. The women of the office are expected to come in early and prepare tea, coffee, and lunch, as well as clean up the cluttered desk before they leave, but Yuki doesn't. After it reaches a boiling point, the women of the office try to reach out to Shima and ask him if he can reprimand her for them. They believe that if they go and speak to her again, it'll get brushed off as cattiness between women. And they think that homegirl will take it a bit more seriously coming from a big bad manager man. Shima is up for his next big promotion from subsection chief to section chief, which if you work in a corporate setting just means he's about to get double the responsibilities for like $2 extra. Shima wants to show his coworkers that he can be a boss, but he's a pretty mild-mannered guy. He really struggles to find the courage to speak to her sternly, but one day he musters it up and he yells at her for slacking off instead of working on some reports he had asked for earlier that day. To that, she just calmly replies that she had done it already and she had left them on his desk as he had asked her to. To Shima's surprise, the reports were perfect and they were done quicker than he had expected them to be. Sometime later that week, Shima runs into Yuki in a storage room, and in classic femme fatale fashion, Yuki gives him a kiss on his shirt collar. Obviously, hilarity ensues as Shima tries to get the lipstick stain off his collar and he's left feeling really awkward throughout the rest of his day. Shima, knowing that his promotion evaluation is coming up, decides that the best thing for him to do is to talk to Yuki after work, and to then try to get her to take a more agreeable approach to interacting with her coworkers. While they eat, Shima learns that Yuki is an only child of a wealthy family in the countryside of Japan who sent her to university overseas. I think she talks about things like going to France and learning how to ski in the Alps. Shima learned that not only is this girl wealthy, but she has experiences, education, and a worldview that honestly makes him feel pretty small. Shima considers himself a pretty up-to-date and progressive thinker. He reads a lot of the famous philosophers and authors of his time, but in talking to Yuki, he finds that she knows about all of those things and more. And all of this only a few years removed from college. What's supposed to be a stern talking to over dinner ends up turning into a night of drunk karaoke that ends with the two of them, yeah. So all throughout the end of this chapter, Shima has got the shakes. And logically you think it's because, he just cheated on his wife and crossed the line with a coworker, just jeopardized his family for a girl he don't really know from a can of paint, but no, it's because he's done something like that literally weeks away from his big evaluation. When he goes back to work, he has no idea what to expect from Yuki, but for the most part, she just keeps it player. It's like they never did anything. A few weeks later, Shima gets the promotion and Yuki calls his house to tell him to show up to a cafe. Once there, she congratulates him on his promotion, and then she tells him that she is engaged and will be leaving the office. After that, she invites him to her wedding, and the chapter comes to a close with the scenes of Yuki's wedding. And when he gets there, Shima notices that although she is smiling, she has a bit of a glossy look in her eyes. From his perspective, it looks like she's just going through the motion. Yuki's getting married to a guy from a wealthy farming family and moving back out to the countryside to live on their farm. The only time Shima notices a genuine smile from Yuki is when she turns to him and says, "This." And this was pretty much what sold me on this manga, at least to read a few more chapters of the series. From my perspective, this chapter is trying to shine a light on Yuki's social disobedience. Obviously, it's through the lens of her sleeping with her manager in a pretty inappropriate setting and method, but I think things like her refusing to make tea, refusing to clean up, and leaving at 5 o'clock on the dot are actions that are reflective of a person who is pretty much lashing out at life in this hamster wheel. She recounts her life prior to this job as so much more expansive and expressive than the life that she's going to live working like this. I can only imagine the experience of going from the countryside of Japan to the south of France and getting to experience things that nobody in this company in the middle of Tokyo can even relate to. And I can't imagine coming back home and realizing that you only have but a few options available. It's either work a desk job or get married to a wealthy man and live on a farm. And that's if we assume that choosing a partner was a decision that was left up to her. But for the choices that were her own, she played them how she wanted to. She showed up to work when she absolutely had to, she left work as soon as she absolutely could. She did everything within her job description, and she talked and read magazines when she was finished. It's quiet quitting in the 1980s, and I identify with her real bad. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but the series has a lot of other stories like that. Especially from its female characters, but also from its male characters, where it just finds different ways to illustrate that sense of frustration and powerlessness. The stories often trend towards a femme fatale-esque weaponization of women's femininity to try and create some sense of control in their lives. Actually, describing it as their femininity is kinda inaccurate. It's less that and more about them finessing the position that society expects women to play. It's not always revolving around sex, but it's usually somewhere within the social economics framework. If we're not all the way comfortable with that, there are many other themes that Hirokane touches on that were very interesting to me. As salacious as the story is, there are just as many arcs and characters whose stories center around the real-world socio-political climate of 1980s Japan. One of the things that had me locked in was how the story dealt with the fallout of the youth rebellion movement in Japan. The Zenkyoto, or the All-Campus Joint Struggle Committee, was a leftist anti-government group of college students in the late 1960s in Japan. At the time, there were several different college groups that held radical protests against the institutionalized oppression that Japanese youth felt that they were being constricted to in the university to workforce pipeline. I had to look it up because, these kids were getting to it. The Zenkyoto was not the only radical youth movement of the time. Most of the other radical youth groups came from a schism within the Japanese Communist Party, and they were generally known as the New Left. The earlier groups were more angled towards the limits around economic mobility and the disparity in finding work for students that were not in upper class families, as well as other things. Like a lot of youth groups were critical of and in mass radical protest of Japan's treaty with the United States. They were really outside to stand against Japan's support of the United States' occupation of Vietnam. And this manga actually reflects a lot of the people of that time's sentiments towards the Zenkyoto. These university students in these specific groups were generally the product of upper middle class families that could afford to send their kids to universities. And also, although unwillingly, had the privilege to and proximity to these corporate jobs to just slide into that system. Having graduated from law school in 1969 and spending 4 years working in a corporate position, Hirokane was able to recreate the many different types of characters that took part in these protests as university students, as well as the feeling of contempt or disapproval for the futility of the Zenkyoto movement specifically. It's like you did all of that fight the man stuff just to turn around and work corporate anyways. He also shows the people that stuck to their guns because they didn't want to just become an analyst. They wanted to be photographers, designers, or mangaka, mirroring real life Japan at that time. I feel like I could go on and on about this series because it takes such a realistic approach, although again, a bit hyperbolic, but a realistic approach to a lot of things socially that I was unaware of within Japan and within Japan's work culture. There's even stuff I just didn't expect to see playing out in a 1980s setting. Like, last example, I promise, it was one of my favorite parts to read. There's an arc that involves a polyamorous relationship between Shima and 2 other people after his job sends him all the way to New York for 2 years. And it really takes the time to kind of peruse the feelings of being in this coupled relationship with other people and feeling a sense of community that he was unable to feel when he was in Japan. Hirokane does a really good job at trying to show the problems with conservative thinking when it comes to enjoying life and moving forward. You can tell that Hirokane was impacted by the New Left movement of 1960s Japan because he has something to say about the way a lot of people in Japan were living. So yeah, there we have it. Those are the seinen series I've been keeping up with for the last 6 or so months. Let me know what you guys have been checking up on. Frieren and Dungeon Meshi have been going crazy for the last 6 or so months. I've been catching up on those myself, so let me know in the comments if you guys are caught up on those series and put me on to anything else you've been watching. That's it for me. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.